You are just too narrow-minded. You're just too narrow-minded. That's one of the most biting critiques in our world today, isn't it? To call somebody narrow-minded, to say you just have a closed mind, you're so closed off, you can't see the world outside of this. We live in a world where our age, one philosopher has called this the age of authenticity, which is to say that the greatest good in our world is that we would be true to who we are, true to ourselves, which in our context means that we have freedom of choice. We have freedom to choose how we live, freedom to choose who we are, so that how we live will reflect who we are individually. It's a very individualistic way of looking at the world. And so in a society that values authenticity in this way, the greatest value is actually choice. And the only true virtue in a society like this is tolerance. What does it mean to be a good, virtuous person? It's to tolerate everyone else, to tolerate their self-expressions, their ability to choose what they want to do, to choose who they are. And those who see things more narrowly fly right in the face of that, doesn't it? So to call somebody narrow-minded is to say you are anti-society, you are anti-social, literally anti-social. You fly in the face of everything that our society, our 21st century American society, stands for. You're just too narrow-minded. I was Googling around this week in preparation for this sermon, and I found this list that said 10 signs that you are narrow-minded. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. So, and for everyone, they had like 10 counting down to 1, right? The clickbait articles. So they had a picture and a statement, and the statements were things like, when you find out that somebody doesn't agree with you or believe the same as you can't stay in relationship with them, right? You have a hard time considering that the way you see things might not be the actual the way that everybody experiences things. Down at the bottom, number 1, the top reason was if you place a high value on righteousness. And the picture for that one was a picture of somebody kneeling before the cross. In many ways, Christianity is the picture of narrow-mindedness in our society. And I think this is one of the bones that people pick with religious people in general, but especially with the church. You are just too narrow. Is the church, is Christianity too narrow? That's our question for today. Is Christianity too narrow? I think that in certain situations, the answer to that is yes. Now, I think that there are good ways to be narrow and bad ways to be narrow, but I think sometimes the critiques point at ways in which Christianity is narrow that are not necessarily good things. Sometimes Christians can be narrow on the truth. Now, hear me out on this. I'm not saying that there isn't such thing as objective truth, but what I'm saying is what we saw in the video here. Sometimes Christians can say, I understand the truth. I have a corner on the truth. I have it all figured out. So if somebody else says something that doesn't agree with my understanding of the truth, well, then they must be wrong, right? And so we get so narrow-minded, we get so fixated on our vision of the truth that we think that there's no truth outside of that. C.S. Lewis reminds us that all truth is God's truth. Just because we celebrate that there is truth in Christianity doesn't mean that God hasn't expressed truth in other ways in this world. Sometimes the church is accused of being narrow on culture. This one brings me back to my days in youth group and going to Christian music festivals. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a Christian music festival, but if you want like a dose of the Christian subculture, the white Christian subculture, that's the place to get it. You can buy the t-shirts, you can buy the CDs, you can use all the Christian language, the lingo that we use. Hey, let's have some fellowship. What does that mean to people outside of the church, right? Fellowship, it means like some sort of a job apprenticeship or something. We use these funny words, and everybody understands what we mean when we stay inside of our Christian bubble. We can be so narrow on culture, and this becomes a problem when we assume that our way, our cultural expression of Christianity is the only valid way. Or we at least hold up our way of expressing Christianity as the standard by which all other expressions should be judged. The white evangelical church does this all the time. We look at somebody else's faith and practice and we say, oh, that's not right. This is not right. And we set ourselves up as the arbitrators of what is right and what is wrong. This has led to drastic damage and hurt. Sometimes our church, and I think not our church specifically, but Christianity in general, sometimes we are accused of being narrow on morality, narrow on what is right and wrong. This one is a huge one in our time. Sometimes this comes as a charge of hypocrisy, right? We see Christian leaders who preach, do not be greedy, let go of the wealth, and yet they themselves are amassing wealth. We have Christian leaders who say, don't be prideful, you need to submit yourself to Christ, humble yourself at the feet of your brothers and sisters, and yet these leaders are drunk on their own power and can't see any other way of doing things, and they abuse people in the process. Charges of hypocrisy on the one hand. But I think the more frequent accusation is an accusation of judgmentalism. The church is just too judgmental. We have our understanding of what is right and what is wrong, and certainly Scripture speaks about these things, and Scripture lays out a path for us to follow. But the problem is when we get narrow on this, and we identify one particular sin du jour, one particular sin that is worse than all the rest, right? We've done this in every generation. So generations ago, it was certain vices like drinking and smoking, things that good Christians don't do. It was playing cards and going to the movies in my grandparents' day. It was not so long ago, it was divorce. If you've been divorced, then you are somehow less than. Your sin is somehow worse than the rest of us. We start to set up these bifurcations of good church people over here, good Christians over here, and those people. Of course, in our time, and the reason that more of my peers aren't in this fellowship right now, it's the issue of homosexuality and LGBT inclusion in the church. The world sees the church being narrow-minded on this issue and judgmental, not just as a way of holding our convictions humbly and gently yet firmly, but we heap up shame and we heap up guilt, and we set up this us and them. So much so people, maybe even in our own midst, who are wrestling with questions about their sexuality, don't feel like it's safe to ask those questions. Don't feel like it's safe to do that. And we set up these systems of shame. Families, Christian families, who disown their kids because of their lifestyle decisions in this area. Churches that push people away because they say the choices you're making are not welcome here. Is Christianity too narrow? The problem is when we get narrow, assuming that we know the truth, when we get narrow on our cultural expressions, when we get narrow on morality and heap up guilt and shame on certain groups of people, what we're doing is actually excluding people from the grace of God. Our religious vision narrows down, and suddenly anybody who isn't in this realm, who is outside of our vision, is somehow other than, somehow less than. And when we do that, we don't have much to say to those people who are outside of our religious vision other than, well, you're wrong. You're wrong. And sometimes, less gracefully, you're not welcome here. Is Christianity too narrow? I think we have to say sometimes it is. And if we ask Jesus this, I think that insofar as our religious vision excludes other people from God's grace and from them coming to Him, I think that He would say, yes, sometimes Christianity is too narrow. Jesus had a lot of things to say about this, actually, in his ministry. Luke chapter 5, we see Jesus going to Matthew, and Matthew's a tax collector. He's sitting in his tax booth. He says, Matthew, come follow me. And Matthew says, well, come to my house. I'm going to invite all my friends, my friend tax collectors. And the Pharisees see what's happening here as Jesus is on his way to the house. And the Pharisees say, what are you doing, Jesus? You're eating with tax collectors and sinners. How dare you associate with those people? And Jesus says this, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, those who think they are righteous anyway, but sinners to repentance. And then we get down to it in Matthew chapter 23. And this is perhaps Jesus' strongest words of criticism. I think it's interesting that he saves these words for the most religious people of his day. Listen to this. This is just a sampling. You can read the whole chapter if you want to. Matthew 23, verse 23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. You're missing the point. Your religious vision is too narrow, Jesus is saying. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish, then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You look like whitewashed tombs, which are beautiful on the inside, but on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Jesus had little patience for this kind of narrowing, this kind of vision that excludes people from the grace of God, this kind of blindness that keeps us from seeing ourselves as we really are, that keeps us from seeing the impacts of our actions for what they really are. Jesus had little patience for this kind of narrow, rigid religiosity. Let's set aside this first question for a moment. Is Christianity too narrow? Yes, sometimes. Or for a moment, let's ask a slightly different question, and that is this. Is Christianity narrow? Even as Jesus criticizes the narrowness of the religion of his day, I think we can't deny that, in fact, Jesus laid out a very narrow path for people to follow. He charts out a narrow course for us and for his disciples. As we look at Jesus' life, we see that, yes, Christianity is, in fact, quite narrow. Christianity, in fact, narrows down on the person of Jesus. And when you think about who Jesus is, this is a Jewish man who lived nearly 2,000 years ago. He died when he was 33 years old. He's only on this earth for 33 years. He had a ministry that only lasted 3 years. That's 1 year from now, if I'm counting my ministry. So hopefully mine lasts longer than that. 3 years before his actions and words got him crucified by the Romans and the Jews. And he only traveled as far as he could walk. He had a very, very narrow life in our standards today. And yet all of our belief and practice and faith narrows down on this one person. This one, the incarnation, right? Of course, he's not just a man, God and man. But all of Christianity narrows down on the person of Jesus Christ. Now, what's interesting about this is that this claim of narrowness is not all that unique, actually. Yes, Christianity is narrow, but every religious system is narrow in one way or another. Whether you believe that there is one God or many gods, whether you believe that God is far off or nearby, or somehow we are a part of this life force that is God, all of these claims are mutually exclusive. Christianity is not unique in this aspect of being narrow. But what sets Christianity apart in its narrowness is that we believe that religion isn't about us trying to reach God. Religion isn't about us stacking up our good accomplishments or arriving at some elevated understanding to reach God and to be able to understand Him and achieve some sort of divine life. But Christianity is narrow in exactly the opposite way, in that God is the only one who has reached out to us in Jesus Christ. In the uniqueness of Jesus Christ and His life, death, and resurrection, this is the one place where God reaches out to us in a way that we can actually be with Him. This is the one way that He has opened up. We don't reach up to God. God has reached out to us. I want to read the passage that Karen read for us earlier today, Matthew chapter 7, which talks about the narrowness pretty clearly here. Jesus is getting to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and if you read through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus sets the bar really high. In fact, he even says, your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. You must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Talk about charting out a narrow course, right? And then he gets down to the end, and to kind of sum all of this up and explain the choices that are laying before his listeners that day, he says this in chapter 7, verse 13, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Jesus is very clear that the way is narrow. When he talks about this wide path, narrow path, he's striking the notes from this melody that's been played all throughout the Old Testament, this wisdom tradition that lays two ways before people. We see this in the book of Deuteronomy. We see it in the Psalms and the Proverbs, even in the prophets. And Jeremiah sums this up pretty well. Jeremiah 21, he says, thus says the Lord, see, I'm setting before you the way of life and the way of death. It's a choice for us to make. Which path will we take? Which way will we walk? The way of wisdom or the way of foolishness? The way of life, the way that leads to death? Jesus says that, yes, clearly the way is very narrow. Now this idea chafes against our sensibilities in our society today, doesn't it? That there would be one way that leads to life and a whole bunch of ways that lead to death. Now, I don't necessarily think that means that there's only one course of action in our lives that we can choose that is the right way. But I do think that what it's talking about is this way of wisdom, this way of understanding, this way of walking in line with God's goodness and his righteousness that can be expressed in many different ways, right? We don't all live the same life. And yet there is this one way. Now, while that narrowness may chafe against our love of freedom and choice and all of that, I think that in many ways in our lives we are actually pretty narrow. And in fact, I want narrowness in certain areas of my life. If I'm going into surgery, I don't want my surgeon to take a broad path. I want him to take the narrow path that his training and experience has led him to know how he can fix the issue that's going on, right? We do this in our own lives all the time. Even while we say that there are lots of choices in our lives, we spend an awful lot of time and energy discerning what is the right path for my life, right? We decide what will we commit to, what responsibilities will we fulfill. If we're early on in our lives, we decide what road of education or life experience is going to lead to the kind of life that I want to live. We don't assume that we're just going to happen across the way that leads to life. We don't assume that we're just going to stumble across the path that leads to goodness. No, we chart out our course carefully as we walk. This idea of narrowness is not something that we are strangers to, nor is it always bad. Jesus makes perhaps the narrowest claim in John chapter 14, verse 6. And he's talking to his disciples right before he's about to be crucified. And he says to them, I'm going away. I'm going to prepare a place for you. You will follow me to where I am. And Thomas is panicking. He says, Jesus, we have no clue where you're going. How could we possibly follow you? We don't know the way. And Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Where's the way? I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Oh man, whenever I come across this verse, I cringe a little bit at the narrowness of that, right? At the narrowness of Jesus is the only way. And yet the more I sit with that, I've come to see that this is not necessarily a statement of exclusion as much as it is a statement of inclusion. Because it wasn't like Jesus came along and shut off all these other courses that we had to get to God. There was no other way before Jesus came. There was no other opening, no other way for us to be with God, no other way for us to know God. And Jesus has opened up a way. Yes, it's one way. It narrows down on this person of Jesus Christ, but it is a way. And it provides a way for all who would walk in it to find hope and life, to find our way into the broad expanses of God's grace. Now, the objection usually comes up here, okay, but I look at the world around me And there are lots of different ways to live our lives. There are no one way, no one right way. As long as we're tolerant of others, as long as we do good things, right? We try to be good people. The path is broad. What does it matter what God you believe in? As long as you're trying to do good and loving people. Isn't that what Jesus wanted anyway? As long as I don't harm other people, as long as I love other people, as long as I try not to be selfish, as long as I try to make the world a better place. Isn't that enough? Isn't that enough? So we kind of sample different spiritualities. And I see this all the time. We take different parts of different religions and things that we believe in, and sometimes we make our own conglomerated spirituality. Or sometimes we just try to build an ethical code that excludes God entirely. We see this happening in our society all the time. It's what's taught in our schools. It's this democratic morality that is basically, as long as I don't do harm to you, let's live and let live, right? And it's good. And there's a lot of good things that come out of that. The sense of justice that we have. But there's one big problem with all of this. One big problem. And that problem is sin. The problem is sin. And I know that's a churchy word. So let's break that down a little bit. The problem is that we live in a broken world. The problem is that we live in a fractured world. We live in a world where we are unable to do good on our own. Yes, there are limited ways that we can do good things. But when it comes down to it, there's still this brokenness that seeps into us. Sin is sticky. It sticks to us, right? Some of us know this in our individual lives, those actions, those things, those temptations that keep on coming back over and over and over again, those addictions, those attachments that we've made. And we just can't seem to be free of them on our own. Sin is sticky. But I don't think that gets it to it enough. Sin is actually all pervasive. It pervades everything. It seeps down into our lives. We are broken people. Why do I say this? And I see this exhibited because we are unable to do the good that we want to do. I see this all the time. The Apostle Paul talks about this in Romans 7. He says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And then a little later he says, for I have the desire to do what is good. So many of us have that desire, don't we? To do what is good, to love others. I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good that I want to do, but the evil that I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. My friends, if we can't figure out, if we can't live good lives, if we can't figure out how to fix the brokenness in our own lives, we can't fix the brokenness in our world either. We are stuck. We are stuck without any way forward. And this is not just on the individual level. You consider somebody like Reinhold Niebuhr who said, you can have a whole society of people who are perfectly moral, perfectly selfless, and give up all that they have for the sake of the common good. But that society as a whole can be perfectly selfish and evil and wicked to other societies. It's really insidious how sin works on so many different levels, our individual levels, our societal levels. So we see that this brokenness pervades everything. My friends, if all we needed was to be better people, all we needed was to be nicer people, if all we needed was to love people better, and the sin and brokenness of this world would go away, don't you think we'd be in a better place by now? If all we needed was to be a little bit more enlightened, if all we needed was to have a better understanding of what human rights are, we would have found some solutions to the problems that are before us. But what we see is these issues coming back over and over and over again. And sin is so insidious that it even camouflages itself so that sometimes we think that we're doing really good things and we're actually harming and hurting people. There is no way out. There is no way out aside from the way that God provides for us. So this broad path that seems really good, just be good to people, just love people, just try to make the world a better place, starts to narrow down because we can't escape our brokenness. We can't escape the things that are in us that just keep on doing what we don't want to do. And so this path becomes a funnel. The broad path becomes a funnel that leads down to death and destruction. This is the pain of our world today. Sin is enmeshed and embedded in all of our relationships, our actions. It's twisted and broken and distorted every relationship with one another, with God, our societies, our systems, our states. Sin is in the middle of all of this. There's only one answer. Call it narrow, but there's only one answer. Jesus Christ, who has broken the power of sin, who has shown us that sin does not always need to lead to death, but he has a way through that to new life and redemption. Is Christianity too narrow? Yes, sometimes it is. And in those circumstances where we try to narrow down the grace of God and exclude other people, we need to confess. Jesus has harsh words for us. We need to hold humbly the truth that we have, saying that we don't have the truth, we don't possess the truth, but we do know the truth. Because Jesus is the truth. We don't have him all figured out. We've got some perspectives that are off base. We don't understand everything, but we know where to find the truth. We know where to find the truth, Jesus Christ. Is Christianity narrow? Yes. Is that a bad thing? No. No, certainly not. It is not a bad thing, because that narrow way, Jesus' way, this story that centers down in on the person of Jesus Christ, is the one way that we find freedom from sin and brokenness and healing for our world. If the broad way leads down to death and destruction, this narrow way that Jesus charts out for us actually opens up into the broad, wide open spaces of God's grace. Romans chapter 3 talks about this, and I wanted to read this, or 5, sorry. I wanted to read this for you in the Message translation. He says, by entering into faith, into what God has always wanted for us, He set us right with Him. He's made us fit for Him. Now we have it all together with God because of our Master Jesus. And that's not all. Catch the imagery here. We throw open our doors to God, and we discover that at the same moment, He's already thrown open the doors to us. And we find ourselves standing where we always hoped we might stand, in the wide open spaces of God's grace and His glory, standing tall and shouting our praise. Yes, the way is narrow, but it opens up into this landscape of grace and goodness and true abundant life. That's what Jesus has come to offer us. As we look at this path, this narrow path that broadens out, we see that Jesus doesn't just have plans for us, doesn't just have plans for Christians, doesn't just have plans for the Jewish nation, but He has plans for every nation, every tongue, every tribe. Isaiah 2, the passage that Karen read for us today, talked about that all nations will stream to the mountain of God. This vision at the end is incredibly broad. Every person, every nation, every people finds a place there in that vision. The nations stream to God and they say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that He may teach us His ways, that we may walk in His paths." Because that's the path that leads to life. The road may be narrow, but there's space for everybody. The road may be narrow, but there is space for everybody in the way of Jesus. And it opens up into the goodness and the glory of God. Jesus tells us that only when we find we are willing to walk that narrow way, that way that's only as wide as the cross, when we're willing to walk that way, when we're willing to enter through the gate that is Jesus Christ, willing to see our sin, the sin of this world, to name it, to confess it, to lay it before the cross, and be set free from it by the grace of God, only then will we find true life, true abundant life, and true peace, what this world needs. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.